I was pulled over by a police officer. I'm convinced he was trying to murder me. No, this isn't some story about some racist police officer. I mean, I am black, but that's not the point. Looking back, I should have realized he wasn't human. I was recently driving home in the dark, but a few minutes into the drive, I saw flashing police lights behind me. I have never been pulled over for anything, so I first actually thought that the car just wanted to go past me. I slowed and went to the side of the road, and it turned out the car pulled over with me. I was a bit apprehensive at that point because I've always been a straight-laced kind of guy, no run-ins with the law, and I wanted to keep it that way. I just wound down my window and tried to put my friendliest face on. What happened, though, was way worse than anything I was worried about. I would have preferred to actually have been arrested and spent the night in a jail cell for no reason compared to what I went through that night. The police officer came up, and he introduced himself as Officer Jones. He asked me for my documents, said I was going too fast, but I kind of got the feeling a little bit that the cop had been having a bad day or something, so I just kept my mouth shut and just agreed with everything he said. I knew I wasn't speeding for a fact, but I wasn't going to argue. I had this feeling that he'd made up a reason just to stop me. "You stay here while I go and write you up," said Officer Jones. When he moved away from the window and towards his car, I saw that there was another police officer standing just behind him. "You stay here," said Officer Jones to his partner. "I'm going to write up this man a ticket, and I need you to stay here to keep an eye on him while I do that. Okay, Davis?" He was talking in a very patronizing way. It was like he was talking to someone who's stupid and might not understand, but in a still respectful way, like he's afraid of offending him. Officer Jones went back to the car. The second officer, Davis, stood exactly where he was, rooted to the spot, maybe a couple of arms lengths away from my car. I was curious, so I took a proper look at the second officer. It was dark outside, but the police lights were still flashing from the front, so I could see the face illuminated in interchanging red and blue lights. He looked like he was in his later 30s, but there was something about his face. He seemed just blank, no expression at all. He didn't look back at me when I looked at him. Officer Jones got into the car, and I thought he was writing me out my ticket. But as soon as he got in, he slammed his door shut, and he started to drive away, with the passenger side door of his car still open and flapping. It was like he was just in a hurry to get away, like he'd been waiting for an excuse to get away from that second officer. At the time, I was just really confused about why Officer Jones was driving away. It's not until everything else happened and I thought back on everything in the light of hindsight that it became glaringly obvious that Officer Jones was trying to leave Officer Davis behind and just get away from him in an abrupt way without warning. Except, the second officer had been looking very blank and like an idiot, but as soon as the car engine started up, his expression changed immediately. I saw it happen. Instantly, there was just fury on his face. He caught on almost instantly what that Officer Jones was trying to do: get away. I watched as the second officer ran to the car with absolutely astonishing strength and determination. Officer Davis got beside the car. He had his hands on the open passenger door, and he somehow darted inside the car while it was still moving. The car started wavering and weaving, like there was a commotion going on inside or a fight over the steering wheel, and then it turned abruptly to the right of the road and crashed into a tree. I had no idea what was going on, and though my first instinct was to run, fear of the authorities made me stay. Plus, I was just freaked out and worried, and honestly, I did want to help and make sure they were okay. But that expression on Davis's face had scared me, so I didn't move at first. I just stared at the car. It was rocking, and then it was still. My mouth was dry and I was shaking so badly, and I just sat there for what seemed like ages, but I couldn't just drive off. I didn't really know what to do, but I thought I should maybe just see what had happened. I opened my car door, and I slowly made my way to the police car, just to take a quick peek inside, just to assess the situation. What I saw is a scene that will be forever burned in my memory. Officer Davis was sitting on top of Officer Jones. Officer Jones was covered in this weird black substance, and he was shaking. He was really pale, almost half dead it seemed. There were bruises all over his face and gash over his eye, and Officer Davis was watching his face, with his hands on either side of Officer Jones's head, clutching it, and laughing. I was just frozen, watching the scene. Then Officer Davis threw up on top Officer Jones, making a loud retching noise, and then he started laughing again. I must have made the mistake of making an audible gasp in horror, because Officer Davis's head just snapped around and stared at me. He stopped laughing, and that enraged expression was back. But the weird thing was, his face was different now. He still had eyes and nose, but it kind of looked like they were melted. I only saw his face for a few seconds at that time, but I swear that's what I saw. It made me feel faint. Then he started screaming. It was like he was yelling at me, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. He was just talking made-up words or maybe a language I didn't understand. Officer Davis got out of the car, and when he did, Officer Jones almost flopped out of the car behind him like a dead weight and fell heavily onto the tarmac. It was slippery out of the road, but I just turned and I ran. I ran as fast as I could. I don't know how I outran him. I don't know if he was chasing or just staring at me, but I didn't look back. I got in my car, but a split second later I realized I didn't have my car keys with me. I think I dropped them when I fell. I couldn't start my car. I could see things glinting on the road where I dropped them, but that Officer Davis madman thing was coming after me, and I couldn't go for them. I just got out of the car and I started running in the other direction. I started running the only place I could think of, back to my friend's house, back to where I had originally was driving home from. Eventually, finally, My friend Brett's house loomed in the horizon, and it spurred me to run even faster, even though I was cramping up and bruised and injured from the falls I'd taken. I've never run so fast or so long in my life under such adverse circumstances, and I don't think I ever will be able to again. I got to Brett's door, and I just started pounding on the door and screaming his name, pleading him to open the door. His broken leg would make it difficult for him to get to the door, but I didn't care if he had to drag himself to the door at that point. I just wanted it open. I just wanted to get inside. I had made a surprising headway over the crazy demonic officer. He was 30 paces away from me at least, but he was catching up. I was still crying. My face felt numb with the cold, but my limbs were on fire. I was out of breath and panting hard. There was mucus on my face running down from my nose and into my mouth as I screamed for Brett to come to the door. I felt something cold on the back of me again, and I screamed, but I turned my head while leaning on the door, and I could see that Officer Davis was a few paces away still. He was throwing something at me. He was a few arms' length away from me, and I was staring into his face, which looked like the features were melting off. All I could see were the angry eyes, and he was still shouting these weird garbled words at me. It's weird what goes through your mind when you genuinely think you're going to die. I seriously thought that was it, and then thank God the door opened, and I fell inside through the doorway into the house, directly on top of Brett, and my weight caused him to topple over too. But I got up as fast as I could, still shaking with adrenaline, and I whipped round and I slammed the door shut, right as the officer was at the door. I actually felt the door slam shut against his body. I scrambled to bolt the door and put the chain on, and I ignored Brett's questions. I didn't have the breath or mind to explain. I just leaned against the door and I started to cry. Then the officer started banging against the door. "What the hell was wrong with his face?" said Brett. "What's going on?" I just shook my head helplessly, and I went to the phone, but then I stopped. Should I call the police? What if others were in on this? Whatever the hell this was. I told Brett that we couldn't call the police because there was something very dangerous going on. We were going to have to defend ourselves. I was going to say something more to Brett. I was going to start to try and explain, but then I felt lightheaded, and I felt this dark haze come over my vision, and that's the last thing I remember. I must have passed out. I woke up still on the floor, with Brett staring down at me, concerned. He told me that whoever it was after me had gone after banging on the door and windows a few more times. Of course, Brett demanded an explanation. I told him everything, from the beginning, and neither of us could figure out what to do. I slept on the couch that night, but I think neither of us could sleep much. There was this weird, black, tar-like substance clinging to the back of my neck. I had to peel it off. It felt a bit like pins and needles where it had stuck. It's what he'd been throwing at me while I'd been walking. At the time, I had no idea what it was. It was at night that my body really started hurting too, and I realized I was covered in cuts and grazes and bruises that I'd gotten while running. After discussing it some more the next day, and hearing my story again, and analyzing everything over and over again, Brett convinced me that I should go directly to the station and report what I'd seen happen to Officer Jones. I had no idea who or what the hell Officer Davis was or what his intention had been, but the police did need to know, and they needed to know what had happened to poor Officer Jones. I drove over back into town in Brett's car. We passed my car where it was still on the side of the road exactly how I'd left it, with the door open. We took a quick look on the road, and the contents of my pockets were still on the road too. I picked up my keys and phone and stuff quickly and locked my car door, but I left it where it was and used Brett's car for the journey. The patrol car had gone. Officer Jones' body, which had rolled out of the car and fallen into the road the last time I had seen it, was also gone. We got to the police department, and Brett came in with me on crutches. I told the guy at the desk that I had something to report, and he told me to take a seat, and that someone would be with me shortly. A female police officer came out and introduced herself and shook my hand. She motioned for me to follow her, and as I was doing so, I saw something in the corner of my eye. It was Officer Jones. He was standing inside an office staring out. He looked blank, but he was uninjured. None of the bruises or stuff that I'd seen yesterday. He looked just completely uninjured, except he had this weird blank expression on his face. If I'd gone any further, I would have crossed his line of sight and he would have seen me, but I didn't. My stomach just fell and I knew I had to get out of there. "Excuse me, I forgot something in my car," I said. And I turned back. I went into the reception area, signaled Brett that we had to go. He came after me as fast as the crutches would allow him. I hadn't given my name, so I didn't have to go back. I've just been a mess for the last few days. I can't eat or sleep properly. It's taken me a while to get into a fit enough and coherent state to be able to explain all this and type this out to share with others. I keep having nightmares about it. I'm so much more afraid of a police car because I'm terrified I'll run into that monster again. Or worse still, that it's turned into someone else now. It could be anywhere, as anyone. Since I haven't left my house, someone keeps knocking on my door. I don't know who it is, and I don't want to know. I'm afraid to leave, and the cuts and bruises are getting worse. But last night, when I looked at myself in the mirror, I almost fainted. My eyes were pitch black, and my face looked like it was melting.